and the appeal. Today, we're continuing our discussion of how to stop police killings of Black people. We're joined by Philadelphia City Council members Helen Gim and Kendra Brooks, and we're going to talk about the fight over Philadelphia's proposed spending on police in the wake of more and more killings. Cities across the country are reeling in the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and countless others. Police kill Black people every week in America. And despite pandemic-induced proposed budget cuts to waste collection, schools, and even healthcare services, many cities are increasing police spending. We're in the middle of a global pandemic and still failing to adequately focus on the care we need. In Philadelphia recently, peaceful demonstrators were cornered while police fired on them with rubber bullets and tear gas. First-hand accounts show a helicopter dropping tear gas on civilians a week after the anniversary of the MOVE bombing, when in 1985, Philadelphia officials decided to firebomb a house, shooting people trying to escape and killing 11 people, including 5 children, aged 7 to 13. Mayor Jim Kenney proposed a new budget in April after the pandemic that included an 18% reduction for nearly all city services, except the fire department, which would get no cuts, and the police, who actually would get a $14 million increase in their budget relative to before the pandemic. The post-pandemic proposed budget called for allocating $750 million to police, twice the allocation for the next largest department, and about 5 times as much as public health is due to receive in the midst of the pandemic. Policing and prisons took up about a fifth of Mayor Kenney's proposed budget. And in response, 14 of 17 members of Philadelphia City Council have called to reject policing budget increases and call for a set of reforms to policing. That pressure forced Mayor Kenney yesterday to propose a new budget that would eliminate the hike and restore policing back to 2020 levels, which is the first step for demonstrators, but much more is needed to rebalance policing with other budgetary priorities. So today we have with us 2 Philadelphia City Council members, and we're going to talk about the proposed budget and how they are reimagining public safety in Philadelphia. Thanks again for joining us, Councilmember Brooks. I know Councilmember Gim is in a hearing and is planned to join in a bit, so we'll keep a lookout. But I want to start by for over a week, it feels like we've seen video after video of police using supposedly non-lethal force to blind and maim protesters and journalists. I was out in Los Angeles over the weekend protesting, and just seeing the level of police and just seeing the level of police presence and the military style. Like, you could see the LA County sheriffs lined up in a perimeter. There were what looked like snipers on the roof. Like, the scene was, I have to admit, like, really terrifying. And so I'm really interested in talking about how you're responding to protesters in Philadelphia who've demanded an end to these kinds of practices. What are your thoughts about the treatment of protesters in Philadelphia?
I'm definitely not in support of. Thank you so much for having me, Don. I come from the movement. I come from being an activist and boots on the ground. And the fact that we had peaceful protesters that were addressed with tear gas and rubber bullets is definitely problematic, and a showing of use of force here in Philadelphia. And then on the other hand, we also had incidents happening around the city where folks are calling 911 and they can't get help or support. So, I don't know how they came to the decision that peaceful protests should result in tear gas and bullets, but that's definitely problematic, and that's one of the reasons why police reform is necessary in Philadelphia and across this country.
What's the path to implementing some of these changes, right? So we've identified the problem. How do we get there? How do we change these practices?
One of the ways we can change it is making sure is listening to the voice of the advocates. We had a planned $14 million budget increase for the police department, and the advocates, as well as my fellow colleagues, we need to make sure that our police department is showing transparency, as well as accountability, as well as oversight. Like those are the things that are most important. We need to make sure, we need to make sure that we're investing in the things that are most important. And what we know is most important is protecting our communities. And protection does not look like policing. It looks like making sure that we're addressing the social ills, that lead to poverty, that lead to the idea of law and order that we see exhibited by the police. And I think those are the first steps we can really move. We have to begin to look at in order to have solid change. I'm having some internet connection issues as well. My apologies.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We'll talk about some of the systemic changes and talk about techniques as well. So is there a move to ban rubber bullets and things like tear gas being used on peaceful protesters currently?
It's definitely a part of the conversation. Actually, we are currently on the police budget hearings, and a lot of my colleagues brought up those same sentiments on what is the investment that we're currently making into ammunition and rubber bullets and all these things. And it's important that we begin to look at the policies behind the actions, and that's what we're committed to, looking at the policies behind the action. So whether it's the banning the excessive use of force, which I think is already something that shouldn't happen. A lot of it, sometimes we're talking about bans and some things are already on the book and they're not being enforced. So it's a dual conversation. Are we talking about, it's a dual conversation that we need to have together. We're talking about banning and enforcement and making sure that any event that protesters take the streets again around injustice and inequities, they're not met with excessive force. And I think myself and my colleagues are willing to do the work to make sure that we're keeping everyone safe in our city, and that means protecting protesters against excessive force. I'm sorry.
Okay, so in order to protect from excessive force, it sounds like you advocate for banning rubber bullets and tear gas, or no? I don't want to misinterpret. Just want to clarify.
Yes, I think we should ban tear gas and excessive force, especially for peaceful protests.
Absolutely. I'd like to also talk about what additional changes are necessary to protect protesters. And this can go not only into protecting protesters, but also thinking about what accountability looks like from the prosecutor's perspective. So District Attorney Larry Krasner, often the subject of police union anger in Philadelphia, filed charges against one officer already, Staff Inspector Joe Bologna. Although praised by police union head John McNesby as one of the best officers on the force due to his dedication, Bologna appears to have struck a Tempe student in the head and beat the student after provoking peaceful protesters. What changes are needed? What additional changes are needed to protect demonstrators from the perspective of accountability on the back end, right? So not only change the policies, but on the front end, but also for accountability of officers who abuse the policies on the back end.
I think all of this is suited in making sure that officers have adequate training. One of the things I do believe that we can't professional development people out of being racist. That's the reality. But we need to make sure that while we're doing our psych evaluations and all the things that we do in order for the police department to do their hiring process, we need to make sure that folks understand the communities that they're hired to serve in. They understand the complexities of the communities and realizing that it's not a monolith when you entering Black and Brown communities in the city of Philadelphia and around the country. And we need to make sure that an investment is being made to make sure that we have public safety be handled in a different way. And I think that we will continue to push for those things as a step to rebuild and re-envisioning what policing looks like in this country, as well as here in Philadelphia.
So yeah, let's talk about what the future looks like. I know you have been in and out of budget meetings. Leadership support these budget changes, right? So I know there's been a battle. In other words, like, will the policing budget be reduced for next year, and by what percent? Because I know we're talking about levels that have already reduced, but like, what's the future here? And is there support in senior leadership?
Current analysis is that the police budget will be maintained at the FY20 budget. So they will not get an increase, but the conversation hasn't been to
Hi, John.
Hi. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to everybody who's watching and following along from Philadelphia. I'm sure my colleague is going to be right back on, but I can pick up a little bit about where she is. The mayor announced after enormous public pressure and a letter from 14 out of 17 council members that he would not approve an increase in the police budget and keep them flat funded. I do think that there is a push to see the police budget decreased. The majority of our departments are being cut by 10 to 20%. At no point in the last decade has the police department ever suffered a budget cut, and that included during the Great Recession when we closed down 24 public schools. We laid off thousands of city workers and teachers and school personnel. We did not cut the police budget. Kendra, I'm picking up for you for a little bit, and saying that the mayor has made a commitment not to increase the police budget, but I do still think that there is a push to see some resources. For example, we have eviscerated housing resources in the city of Philadelphia in less than a month's time. Thousands of evictions are scheduled to start in landlord-tenant court, with our court officials saying on record that there will be 7 minutes allotted per case in order to get through them all. And so when we eviscerate housing, when we eviscerate rent protections and rental assistance and legal assistance for those facing eviction, and we flat fund the police department, even though it would be one of a handful of police departments, a handful of city departments rather, that would be completely flat funded. The majority of departments have been cut. We have a problem. And I think that the greater the need in our communities, the louder the call that's coming in. I've gotten 10,000 emails at least. Those are the ones I can count. But we've counted up at least 10,000 emails on this issue. There is no question that we can continue to see these things go the way they do without some significant change.
Thank you for saying that and just giving some background about what's not being funded. We know there's at least a recognition of the problem in this area. How are you all going to get there? And specifically, what type of budget changes are you going to demand going forward?
Kendra, do you want to go first?
I missed the first question that you were answering to get the follow-up. I know you jumped in, so my apologies. I'm having technical difficulties here. John, can you repeat that question?
Sure. We're just talking about the budget in the future. So the idea that police has been overfunded recently at the expense of, issues like housing, education. So the question really is, what's the vision, right? So like, what's the vision? Like, what are you going to fight for specifically in terms of budget? Because I think a lot of viewers are trying to understand both the budget process and what we can realistically fight for,
yes.
And also how we want to reimagine, 1 year, 5 year, 10 years down the road. But we don't have to go that far. Just you can start by like
immediately. I want to kind of shadow what Councilwoman Gim has said, and realization that we are facing the largest economic crisis in our lifetime, right? So when we're talking about refocusing the budget, we need to refocus the budget to things that we can use to sustain communities. We realize that we have already have a poverty issue here in the city. We already have a housing issue in the city. We have an education issue here in the city. And those are the things we need to be focusing on. We need to be focused on making sure people are able to stabilize in their communities. We need to make sure that our children are educated in a way that they'll be able to pick up the mantle to run this country next. We need to make sure that post-COVID, that people have quality jobs and housing. Like, all of these things are basic needs in order for people to sustain. And those are the things we need to be focusing on. We realize that an increase to policing and a decrease to social services will not benefit communities in the long term. So it's important that we focus on the needs of the communities. And that means making sure that come last day of school, children have access to parks and recreation centers to be able to release this energy from them also being quarantined for months at a time. We need to make sure that we have sound investments into public education. We need to make sure that these mass evictions that we're anticipating are taken care of. We fought for a diversion program. We fought for illegal lockouts. All of these housing legislations are things that we need to make sure that we're taking care of in order to stabilize Philadelphia. And those are the things that are most important to the majority of Philadelphians, because business can't move if people not working. An economy can't move if people don't have money to spend. And we're going to be at a standstill because we realize that economically people are hurting and struggling. So we need to focus on fixing those issues immediately.
Absolutely.
I would say that
Go ahead.
I would say that we've been here before. We have seen what austerity and recessions have done. They have been points at which greed, capitalism, and exploitation run the game. And so our job on being on council, and why I'm so glad that Councilmember Brooks is here with me as a partner, along with some others, have been to stand against an austerity agenda that would prioritize 1 out of every 6 taxpayer dollars in the city of Philadelphia going towards policing, 1 out of every 5 taxpayer dollars going towards policing and prisons. It was wrong before, it's wrong now. And as we go into the future, we can't double down on that kind of strategy. We've been there. We were in the trenches together fighting austerity when we closed down schools and showed like what happens when you eviscerate out people's capacity to even have institutions that are functioning in their communities. When those systems break down, there is not something else that comes to take its place. It is actually easy to blow things up and to make systems collapse. It is very difficult to protect people and to have systems that work and run for the public good. So that's our responsibility. I'd love to tell you, we have an articulated plan, a budget worksheet that tells you how to do it. This is not how this is going to get done. This is going to take the full pressure of the public. And one of the reasons why I'm so glad that you're doing this with local officials, in part because this battle isn't just about DC and the monster in the White House. It is being waged in city halls, on our streets, in our school boards, and in the district attorney's office, whether we're going to prioritize, I'm late in part because I was asking the police commissioner why we spend so much money on overtime and giving police officers their birthday as a paid holiday, rather than like focusing in on a homicide division and making sure that murders are solved. If we believe that Black Lives Matter, then solve Black murders. And so some of this stuff is what we're pushing on, but you don't have to travel miles and miles to do it. Go down and make some noise, and it will make the difference right now.
You all are amazing. Like, if I could give a standing ovation for that right now, I certainly would. Thinking about local governments and the power that both citizens have residents have to influence like what's happening in their government, I think is really important. I'd like to bring in some polling just to not only talk about the budgets, but also how we can rethink public safety. So, we've talked about housing, we've talked about all the things that create safe communities, but also we could talk about like emergency responders and what that even means. So there's some polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute with Data for Progress, which suggests that 9 in 10 voters support creating an agency of non-law enforcement-based emergency responders. This agency would shift most first responder responsibilities away from traditional law enforcement. That's because most problems arising from substance abuse orders mental illness and poverty require medical professionals and social workers, not criminal enforcement or armed police. We're talking about a care first model. We've seen moves for this in LA County with Justice LA pushing the Board of Supervisors. We've also seen the Cahoots program, which is actually already implemented a program where you call and you dial 911 or 311 or the number, and rather than a police officer arriving, you have someone who is an expert in mental health or whatever the issue is arriving. Do you all support these types of initiatives? And how can Philadelphia help you get there?
These are definitely initiatives that I support. When I think, once again, I entered this world as an activist, and I know the need for community safety or community members coming together to support what community control looks like. And the court issues that you mentioned, the number of domestic violence cases that we see appearing in communities, even right now during this COVID pandemic, those are social services. People need support that need to be addressed. That does not need to be policed immediately. The person who's being victimized needs to make sure they have the adequate services to be able to protect themselves and to get away. When we think about drug addiction, we can't police our way out of drug addiction. Drug addiction needs adequate support, and we need to invest in that. And then we think about deep poverty. People need access to services, and I 100% support more public safety initiatives that focus on care, as you say, as opposed to over-policing, because we see that over-policing of social ills does not work. Yeah. You can't arrest your way out of social ills. We need to address them properly and have the adequate mental health and social services support on the ground to help people come out of these issues. And I'm in full support of that here in Philadelphia. And it's going to take time. We're in the beginning of shifting people's mindset of what policing could be. We have to continue to make people reimagine, the purpose of policing and what services that the police are currently providing that is out of their wheelhouse. And this is the time to do it. While we're calling for to defund the police department, police accountability, police transparency, we need to also make sure that we're putting something in place to take care of those needs that we need. And this is the time. I feel like we're in the peak of making this happen.
I mean, if there's any lesson that I hope we learn from the COVID crisis, is that putting a public health safety first approach is the way to go. During the COVID crisis, the Philadelphia Police Department agreed to a plan to not arrest on quote unquote low level crimes and to issue citations, follow up later with other types of follow up that was not directly related to arrest, incarceration, prosecution, et cetera. And I think, we are just coming out of this. And I think it's an important ask to say, have we learned any lessons from it? Were we able to have any resources from it? A lot of communities had to take that approach. It was our belief that that was the right approach to take, but there is actually something that is different when the public health governs the role that other institutions have to follow. And we need that type of approach right now more than ever. We need to be guided by a sense of what is truly determinative of public safety and the public health. And that is not by leading with policing. It is not by locking people up and throwing away the key. It is not by packing people into courtrooms with minutes in front of a judge and no attorney and no supports. It is not any of those things. So I hope that if there's a lesson that we can learn from this COVID crisis, it's that we need a health first kind of approach to our country, to our cities, to our communities. And we have a lot of lessons to be learned. And if we can dig deep on some of that and partner with Justice Collaborative and others to say, how did these experiments work out? Was there chaos? What we found was that there was not that kind of chaos, that people kind of started to look out for one another. And we're going to have to keep following up on that.
Definitely. Before we wrap, I know you're in the middle of budget negotiations and doing the actual work, but any advice to folks out there that are really trying to figure out how to make sure not only in Philadelphia, but across the country, people are pushing in the same ways that you are. Any advice to just, folks who want to get involved and make sure not only city council members, but mayors and other elected officials are really moving in the space that's consistent with how people are moving in the streets of America?
I want to say organize. I think it's important that we organize and our collective views and voices are put out, not just in the streets. You need to make sure that you're holding your elected officials accountable, making sure that your voices are loud and clear on exactly what you need. That's how we see real change. People have the power. And I think this is the time where we realize that we do have the power to make the changes that we saw or we see happening in Philadelphia came from voices being loud and clear. This is what we want. This is what we need. And the only way we can do that is for us to organize and unify and continue to fight for the things that are most important. And this is across the country, not just in one city. This is as a collective.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is that both Councilmember Brooks and I came in from a background of organizing and leadership, and we saw opportunities at the local level to actually advance a lot of the work that we were doing out in our communities. And so there is a new version of politics that is moving through the country. There are groups like a group that I'm part of called Local Progress. There are other organizations that are connecting and have a deep commitment to racial and economic justice, that are working in collaboration and partnership with Justice Collaborative, that has been a moral and guiding force around how to have a big picture view. It's our responsibility to then get really local, see how it works out at the local level. Everything looks really different. So Kendra is right. Get organized, don't lose hope, be kind, be creative, and keep pushing.
Thank you both so much. And just reminding us that, our budgets really determine our values. Thanks for keeping up the work, and we hope to have you back on soon. Meanwhile, tomorrow we will be on at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time as we continue the policing discussion with Congresswoman Bass and Patrice Cullors. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.